Greetings and welcome to this panel on breaking down barriers between scientists and the public. Through the media, we are very excited about this panel. We've got a really fantastic group of panelists to hear from. And without much further ado, I'd like to just set a couple of ideas around this conversation and then hand over to the panelists. So to introduce myself, my name is Robert Inglis. I represent an organization called Jive Media Africa. We've worked in the science communication space over the past 15 years, and we've been working in that space to try and facilitate conversations, facilitate dialogue between scientists and public audiences. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists. We'll introduce them one by one as we get going. We've had some really fascinating conversations in the lead up to this discussion. And on the panel, we've got scientists from the CSIR, and we've also got representatives of the media from spaces who are working towards trying to take scientific information and share it with bigger audiences. The media, obviously, an incredibly powerful tool for sharing information, ideas, understandings about the way in which science can change the world. But of course, that space is not without its challenges and not without its difficulties. And of course, we often think about this as different cultural spaces. So we have the cultural space in which scientists exist with all of the priorities and all of the ideas which go with that cultural space. And of course, we have the cultural space in which the media and the public operate. And those aren't always exactly the same. The assumptions aren't always the same. The values aren't always the same. And of course, that creates an exciting and dynamic space for interaction. So without further ado, really welcome your participation. Please, can I ask that you take notes of any ideas, share your questions with the panelists. We will give everyone 5 minutes to speak. And then we will be taking questions for the rest of the session and addressing those to the various panelists. First up, we have Katakani Ngobeni. Katakani is a researcher at the CSIR. She is a qualified environmental health practitioner, and she, with her degree from the University of Johannesburg, but has worked in environmental health since then. So Katakani, I'd like to hand over to you. You've got 5 minutes to engage us on some of your own experiences and some of the challenges when it comes to engaging the public through the media around science and technology.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Katekani. As previously mentioned, I'm a senior researcher at the CSIR. Today I was asked to talk about the role of researchers in science communication. However, before I get into that, I'm sure we can all agree that media plays a very critical part, like Robert mentioned, in spreading awareness about the role and importance of science in society. Over the years, I've learned that journalists have the most difficult job of translating and processing detailed, complex information provided by us scientists, which can be very easy, which can't be an easy feat if you think about it. So communication is not only a system of information, but also an integral part of education and development. So without a doubt, mass media plays a very crucial role and influential role in the modes of communication. It has the ability to reach out to even the most remote corners of the world and deliver the intended message. Even though the task to develop innovation and deliver scientific knowledge to the people of different socioeconomic and educational background is a highly challenging job, still it is an essential requirement for any country for its overall growth. So around the world, mass media has already proven to be the most effective tool of science communication. Taking into consideration COVID-19, for example, the most complex systems around the disease had to be broken down to reach as many people as possible. So just to get to some of my experience and encounters in communication science field, the barriers that I've observed, the first one being industrial secrecy driven by competition and patent positioning. In the research field, intellectual property and protection of your ideas and other forms of intellectual creation is very important. So when you're communicating with the media, as a researcher, you always have to take that into account. This might create some trust issues, if I may, where you might much rather not engage with the media at certain stages of a research process to protect your work. What I've learned is that it's very critical to work in collaboration with the in-house communications team, just like the setup that we have at CSIR, because they work as the middleman with the journalists outside of CSIR. So we are very fortunate to have, as the CSIR, to have the comms team whom we know has the best interest of the CSIR and the researcher, as opposed to working with an external journalist who might misconstrue your message or jeopardize your efforts or the efforts of your work. The other barrier that I've noted is the general lack of teaching or communicating training. So science communication is part of the scientist's daily life. So we must do presentations in conferences, write papers or journal articles and proposals, communicate with a variety of audience. Thus, to be a successful scientist, it's very important that you are able to communicate effectively. So science is increasingly multidisciplinary, and the ability to communicate more effectively across disciplines fosters collaboration and innovation. So gone are the days where, as a scientist, you sit in your own office with your ideas. Now you are forced to go out there and engage and share your ideas. Another barrier that I've noted is inappropriate messaging. When scientists are able to communicate effectively beyond their peers to broader non-scientific audiences, it builds support for science, it promotes understanding of its wider relevance to society, it encourages informed decision-making at all levels, from government to communities and to individuals. It can also make science accessible to audience that traditionally have been excluded from the process of science. It can help science more diverse and inclusive. The main aim of research is to change people's lives and to make lives simpler and better. And in order to do that, you need to be able to reach those people at grassroots level. For example, my grandmother stays in a small rural village in Limpopo. I need her to understand the reason why she needs to wear a mask. I need her to understand why is it that she has to go to the nearest community clinic when she observes certain signs and symptoms of COVID, as an example. So with science communication, we're not just communicating science, but we are saving lives as well. And the last barrier that I'm going to touch on is the overuse of scientific jargon. It's okay for me to use jargon when I'm communicating with my peers, but when I'm trying to reach beyond my peers, it's very important that I eliminate the jargon. I've had several engagements with media where I had to communicate my work with the youth for obvious reasons. I had to simplify the message so that it's simpler and understandable, so that I can pitch it at their level. I was also at some point required to communicate in Benek, where I had to translate my work into Tsonga. Therefore, as a scientist, it's very important that you keep the message simple. So in conclusion, I'd end my message with a quote by Albert Einstein, who says that if you can't explain it simply, then you don't understand it well enough. I personally live by this quote and believe that we should ensure that that message is correct, the message that you're putting across is correct and understandable. And this is how, in my opinion, we can bridge the barrier in science communication. Thank you, Robert.
Dr. Kani, thank you. Touching on really interesting points there around secrecy, the need to choose when you're going to be communicating and what you're going to be communicating. The idea of the potential for brokers who can help that message, as Katukani mentioned, those at the CSIR. The need for training, talking about language and simplifying. I really love your quote from Einstein, because in fact, so often we assume that the audience must come to the party. But of course, Einstein really saying there that if you can't explain it, then it's up to you to understand it better. And perhaps understand it in different ways from just a scientific perspective. So thanks very much for those really wonderful contributions. Our next panelist is Lebogang Changela. Lebogang is from the SABC. He is a digital news producer for their online platform with a focus on science, health, and environmental news. And of course, that touches on scientific disciplines all the time, each of those. He's worked as a as an intern at Jacaranda, and then a junior reporter at 702, and now works, as I mentioned, at the SABC, and also attended a summer camp on climate change, a summer school for journalists on climate change, about how can journalists help to make sure that the Paris Agreement gets implemented. So I'd like to hand over to Lebo. I'm really excited to hear from your perspective at the SABC about your thoughts around engaging and breaking down barriers for between scientists and the media.
Greetings, everyone. Maybe you're wondering why didn't I go into politics? Why didn't I go into sports? The good thing about reporting on science is that science offers solutions. I mean, it offers innovations. But the topic at hand is barriers between journalists and scientists. And I just want to share some of my experiences of the barriers that I've encountered as a journalist while working with scientists. The first barrier is trust. In order for journalists and scientists to have a harmonious relationship, I mean, there needs to be trust. But then what really has been a stumbling block or a challenge for me while reporting on science is that sometimes scientists would ask to check my script, but then there needs to be an understanding that as a journalist, I mean, there is an editorial policy that actually that we are governed by, that even though I interview you and I write a script, I mean, there are gatekeepers. After I've written the article, it goes to a sub-editor, and at the end, it's published by an editor. So I always wish that there could be that respect for the different professions. Like a business writer would approach an economist, and there needs to be that a sense of independence where we can just go to a scientist, interview them without them second guessing you. So it's important that there's always trust. Another thing that is a barrier is terminologies and scientific jargon. I wish scientists would use simple language that would be easier to understand. I remember interviewing a University of the Free State scientist, and we're talking about illnesses in chicken, and she was just throwing around jargons, and I would ask her to explain what pathogens are, and she wouldn't want to give explain it and all of that. But there needs to be an understanding that as a journalist, I mean, as much as you've got as a scientist, you've got so much time to be working on your piece or article. I mean, we've only got so much time to actually write the story, so we've got deadlines, so we don't have all the time to actually going and researching and checking jargon, what different things sometimes mean. A good example where there was a harmonious relationship between myself and a scientist was when I was actually reporting on the unveiling of a new fossil called Neo, one of the Homo naledi's. And I remember talking to Lee Berger, and he explained things clearly. I was not intimidated to ask questions. But I must also add that even as a journalist, I mean, we need to also understand the basics of paleontology, also do our homework. Also know that before Neo, what was the other fossil? What is the other Homo naledi? The history behind it and all of that. Another stumbling block or area or barrier is access to information. A lot of scientists are publishing their science in paid platforms. I remember there was a story by one health science organization. I was very interested in that story about a heart attack. But I mean, you had to pay to actually access the journal. So if you are just given an abstract, you don't know what the methodology was and all of that. So that becomes also a barrier. And also, if I may just go on to sometimes with scientists, there's certain protocols, especially if they're working for government. if you need to interview them, I mean, you need to jump hoops because you need to get clearance, or some of them are not willing to talk to you on record. I remember also talking to a nanotechnology professor about acid mine drainage. And because she was funded by government, I mean, she wouldn't go into a lot of nitty-gritties about why the water quality in South Africa is in the state that it is. And that's all I have for you in terms of the barriers between journalists and scientists.
Wow, Lebo, thanks very much. Really throwing down, quite a few ideas of challenges that you faced in your experience as a journalist working with scientists. So thanks very much for sharing those. I'm sure some of the scientists will argue with your suggestion that they've got lots of time on their hands, because I know one of the critical complaints that scientists give around why it's difficult to communicate is exactly around this issue of time and time availability. But I think we're talking a little bit more about the time frames in which we operate. And I think, research takes place over months or years. And of course, journalistic pieces have to be put together in a morning or a matter of hours. So thanks really for raising those. A couple of others, the trust barrier, obviously, whenever you've got cultural groups mixing, that need for trust is there. Understanding the editorial policy, really enlightening that you could just share a couple of your ideas, just to share about how that works. Simple language, jargon, and then access to the information. Of course, a lot of scientific information remains locked up behind a paywall, and of course, you don't necessarily have access to that. So making sure that we get free flow of information between scientists and journalists is obviously really crucial. And thanks really very much for raising some of those. So without further ado, let's hand over to Zamukolo Matiwana. Zamukolo is at the South African Agency for Science and Technology Advancement, a media coordinator there, and is a trained journalist hailing from Makanda in the Eastern Cape, where he did his postgraduate journalism studies at Rhodes University. Very passionate about the role of language in science communication, so I'm sure we're going to hear a little bit about that. And managing a very exciting initiative at SASTA, where community journalists have been placed at, or science journalists have been placed at community radio stations around the country. So perhaps a really interesting partner if you're looking for how to reach audiences in every corner of the country. Over to you, Zamukolo.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think the colleagues, my fellow panelists, have also touched on some of the barriers that I was going to touch on. But maybe before I zoom into my presentation here, I think there are a number of barriers that you can really tease out when it comes to science communication. From the macro level, especially when it comes to the media, you see that science is not seen by editors as a sexy beat. They look at it as sort of something that is boring, that their audience are not interested. So these are the things that when I was doing my studies, I managed to interview some journalists, and they've indicated some of these challenges. At the same time, even when you look at the media, not only in South Africa but globally, there's a pressure in terms of the bottom line as well. So when it comes to the cutting of costs, unfortunately, the science bit is the first casualty. So those are the number of challenges, that can also have a negative impact, when it comes to science communication. But for the sake of my talk today, I would like to confine myself when it comes to the language, because the language, I think is one of the important, and critical barrier that you find in South Africa. Because South Africa is a diverse country, we have about 11 official languages. It is important that when it comes to science communication, you see it, these different languages, communicating science, in diverse languages. But unfortunately, currently there is still a dominance when it comes to the language, there's still a dominance, much more in English and in Afrikaans. So for us, we need to think about, how, do we demolish, that. But I think, maybe there are a couple of things that we can do. One is to really encourage our scientists, to communicate their science in their own, mother tongue languages. How they do that, because when you look at the media landscape, you have a number of media. You have a national media, you have a regional media, you have a local media. But in most cases, scientists, they would like to see themselves in the national media, and then they forget, about some of the, local media, like the community media, radio station, community print, TV, etc. So I think, those platforms, will be able, to assist in terms of communicating, science in diverse languages. The local media is one, can play that critical role. And as well, when it comes to the media in South Africa, the SABC, can play a very critical role when it comes to the languages, because they have, a number of radio stations that broadcast, in diverse languages. So for me, I think there is a need, for the change of focus in terms of when we communicate as scientists, when they communicate their science, they need to look into these kind of platforms. The SABC, the local media, because for me, I think that's very important, because once you communicate science in your own language, in diverse languages, you make science accessible, to almost all the citizens of the country. Because once you communicate your science only in English and in other Afrikaans, it means that, there's another part of our society which will be lagging behind in terms of knowing what's happening when it comes to science. This has been demonstrated, vividly by the pandemic, the COVID-19, because we saw, that, there was that need of communicating, these critical messages in diverse languages. So for me, I hope that, that is not going to stop in terms of, this pandemic, it will continue going forward. But at SASTA, through the support, from the Department of Science and Innovation, we started a science journalism internship program in 2016. This science journalism, internship program, it targets unemployed, graduates in journalism, in communication, and in science. For us, it's been very, good to see, the mix of graduates that we get into the program. Because for me, I always tell them that, even if you're coming from a journalism background, you still have something to learn, because you don't have that science background, So, even if you come from the science background, you still have to learn, how you can narrate your stories and tell your stories in a journalistic way. So both groups, for me, I always tell them, you also have an advantage and a disadvantage. So the beauty of this program is that we do have a number of partners, through collaboration with the Media Development and Diversity Agency. We have about 34, community media partners across the country. And currently, we have about 26, interns, in the program who are contracted in the program. So these interns, their main objective is to really find stories, science stories, technology stories, that are relevant to their community, because the relevance is very important. So that even if they take a global kind of a story, they need to make it, find an angle that can be suitable, for their audience. This we have seen, when it comes to their coverage of the COVID-19, because we have seen how they are managing to tailor, the national stories, that are happening, to try to find an angle for their own local communities. And this, for us, it's very important, because over the past, 6 months, if I look at the coverage from April until September, when it comes to the COVID-19 related stories that were covered, these interns have covered more than 200 stories. So for us, these stories, they touches on different elements. You can go back to talk about the mask, talk about, what the importance of washing your hands. So at the beginning, Those are the critical messages. So I will just stop there now. Thank you very much.
Zamukolo, that's fantastic. Just to be able to have that information at hand about just how many stories are getting out into the media. I've worked in this space for some time, and that's a lot of science stories in the media, and really something to be very proud of in that program. So congratulations on that. Quite a lot of interesting points in there. One of those, that science is just not the same beat as politics, as sport, as others. It's a tougher exercise. It comes with its own challenges, and it takes time. The language issue, maybe even a thought that just as researchers, communicating in your own language might be almost the simplest thing you can do to reach a much bigger audience than we have been able to reach with science in the past. And then this idea, I think, of not only trying to go for the national, going for the major radio stations. I think it's really important to acknowledge that we can have impacts on people's lives without necessarily going out on those big radio stations. And of course, that opportunities lead to more opportunities. And of course, opportunities to go on those smaller radio stations could actually present the chance to perhaps improve your skills as a researcher talking to public audiences in that space. So really, thanks very much for sharing some of that. I'm told that Rusana Philander is having some connection issues. So I just want to confirm. I see Rusana is on this call, but I don't see audio connected. So we're going to move on to the next panelist, and that's Chanel Retief. Chanel Retief is a multimedia reporter at Forbes Africa, and prior to that was a journalist at Daily Maverick. So we're really dealing with a great team here. Chanel graduated in journalism and media studies at Rhodes University and covered the Fees Must Fall and other protests in 2016, and decided through that she wanted to move into telling hard-hitting stories. And of course, working with science gives that opportunity to tell incredible stories, but obviously comes with its own challenges. So Chanel, if you can give us some insight from your perspective working at Forbes Africa.
Hi everyone, I hope everyone can hear me. I'm Chanel, as Robert has said, and I'm from Forbes Africa. I think my colleagues have mentioned all the difficulties that come with reporting science in this space. But I think one of the things that I'd like to point out is that I'm still new to journalism. I mean, I only started out 2 years ago. So, and I think the biggest challenge I had in terms of being a general reporter and being a multimedia reporter is trying to find out who to speak to, navigating who can give me the right sort of information, what experts I can speak to, especially when it comes to science. I found it very difficult. And moving it back into the space of training, I think someone did mention training, is that when you're in a university space and studying journalism, the first critical thing they teach you is political journalism, because it's the easiest, not the easiest, but it's the most natural course to take in terms of journalism. And as someone has already said, science isn't as sexy as politics or lifestyle journalism or sports journalism. It doesn't get the same amount of recognition as your political journalism. And being a general reporter has put me in a space where you can sort of see where people's heads are at in terms of audience, what people prefer to read, what people prefer to take in. And my biggest passion as a multimedia journalist is trying to find new ways and innovative ways to tell a story so that it captures everyone's attention. The easiest example I can give you is recently I was working with an African entrepreneur who is creating this line of skincare products. And this all came about because she was using products on her skin and she realized the ingredients in that wasn't good, you know, so she decided she's going to find a way to create a product that is good for her skin but good for everyone else, and try and find a way that this is 100% natural. For me, there was scientific jargon that she used that I did not understand. So I could take the time, because it was a long-term story, I could take the time to sit down with her, discuss all the terminology, discuss everything that goes into building products like this. And from a Forbes Africa perspective, that's a good story, because that's a business story mixed with a little bit of science and looking at, okay, what is the science of making a product? What does 100% green mean? What is, those sorts of aspects are extremely important. But if I take a different example, during my time at Daily Maverick, when I was working on an ESCOM story. Now, ESCOM is a big story. It's a hard-hitting story. It's a nationwide story. So when trying to speak to experts, that was my biggest difficulty, finding someone to speak to, an energy expert or a scientist who can tell me the ins and outs of how these things work. That was one of my biggest difficulties. And then eventually, when finding an expert to speak to, when they use large terminology or large words that I don't understand, again, because I'm a new journalist, it's such a difficult position to be in, because you don't want to make a fool of yourself, because you're a young journalist, you're still starting out, you still want to make a good impression, you want people to remember you so that next time they have an exclusive, they'll come directly to you. But then at the same time, you need to know what IRP is, or whatever big word they're using, or whatever project they're working on, because that's an important story to tell. And also taking it back to my whole thing about ways of telling stories, is that because I'm a multimedia storyteller, my biggest goal is to be informative and make sure that the story is as interesting as it possibly can be. So in making sure, firstly, we need to find a way to ensure that people who don't have access to these sorts of information get access to this information, but also making it interesting for them. Languages is one part of it, but also if you're going to give someone 500 to 1,000 words to read on science, I can guarantee you they're going to get through the first 50 words and they're going to be bored. So we also have to find a way to collaborate with scientists that we can tell a story in a more visually appealing way, whether it be via podcast, but again, it has to be accessible to those who can listen to a podcast, videos, working with broadcasters in terms of making sure that that information is out there. I think COVID-19 has taught us now more than ever that access to information is limiting, but there needs to be a way in which we can get that information out there. Part of our motto at Forbes Africa is being part of the African growth story. And the only way we can be part of that African growth story is if we find ways to ensure that we tell the stories in the most informative way, the most interesting way, and make sure that everyone has access to this information. I think I've gone over time. But yeah, that's it from my end.
Chanel, fantastic. Thanks very much. Really great again to hear from someone perhaps working in a diverse and different media space and a fast-paced one as well. I noticed a couple of things. I mean, one is your kind of obsession with finding the best medium through which to tell that story. And of course, we as scientists, we may not be thinking of what's the best way to tell the story. We're thinking about the information that needs to be transferred. But that's your task, is to think about what's the best way, and we need to find ways of strengthening those relationships. And then you said as to tell the story in the most interesting way as possible, and as of interest to as many people as possible. And of course, when we do science, we're not necessarily thinking about how do we make this accessible or interesting to a wide audience. Whether it's important or not, it doesn't necessarily we don't necessarily think about how to make it appealing to that audience. So there's discussions there. And then finding the right person. I just picked up that one. Really sometimes quite difficult to find just the right person. And of course, representation matters. And of course, you're looking for diversity in who's speaking about science. As we probably know from the study done by Marina Hubert a couple of years ago at Stellenbosch University, 78% of the visible scientists in the country are male, the ones that, and 63% are white. So it's really, while science is transforming, the people who talk about science in media spaces has yet to catch up. And of course, that's always a challenge. So thanks really for raising those excellent points and for sharing your experiences. I do have Rosanna Philander. I'm just gonna. I see it doesn't have a microphone shining up here, so I'm gonna hand over to Rosanna. Rosanna, let's just take a chance and see if we can get this to work. But Rosanna Philander is a journalist who studied. Okay, it does sound like we're not going to hear from Rosanna. If we do get her back a little bit later, we'll give her an introduction and a chance to pop a few ideas into the conversation. So I think that's really set a really rich landscape for a discussion about how we handle some of these tensions, how we handle some of these barriers to communications on the basis that we do effectively understand and believe that it's really important to create better engagement between science and the society that it impacts upon. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through on the chat. Please, by all means, send us some more questions. I'm going to start here with a question to Katikani. The question is, what channels can you identify for use during the transfer of knowledge and engagement? Well, can you identify for use for the transfer of knowledge and engage in rural publics? So, Katikani, that question, a little bit more here. Because of COVID-19, science communication has shifted again from face-to-face engagement to virtual engagement, which is an impediment for some rural communities. Certainly can see that that's the case. It enhances the engagement for some, but for others, it really cuts people out of the conversations. Therefore, what will you suggest as a drive to instill the public engagement, looking at the barriers such as expensive data, poor networks, translation of scientific terms into layman's language? That's quite a lot of questions. Perhaps you can pick something out of there. On the issue of indigenous knowledge, don't you think it might have an effect as they write their exams in English? I see that's to Katikani, but I'm quite sure that Zamakolo has got a couple of thoughts on some of those topics. So I'm handing over to you, Katikani.
Okay, so those are very interesting questions, and I think they're also touching on part of my passion for communication, because I'm a scientist, but at the same time, my job is to take the message to the people. And I think we've established, I think at CSIR, we've pretty much established a working formula, and it's really working at a good rate. Because what we have done to bridge the gap between the media outside of CSIR and the journalists, what they do is, for example, as a research, we have research groups. So in a research group, they would identify certain people, couple of people who will spearhead research communication. Okay, so what they do with those individuals that they've selected, they take them for science communication training. Because as a scientist, you're trained on how to write an abstract, like one of my colleagues was saying, but you don't necessarily know how to write a press release. So this is where you get to do the training on how to communicate science effectively and make it and break it down to be in the most simplest, digestible English, not just English and other forms of languages. So what we have done at CSIR, that is one way where we identify people to spearhead science communication. So if there's a journalist who's interested in a story related to what we are working on, that person is going to work with that person who is identified, who has attended training on science communication, so that they can be able to transfer and share that knowledge. And it makes it easier because Lebo was mentioning that sometimes they just send you an abstract with large jargons. You don't even know how to interpret that. So that this is where that comes into play, that it makes it easier for the journalist to be able to publish something to write on. And with regards to bridging the gap with innovation and taking the information to grassroots level, we don't just, as Zamakolo was also mentioning, that we don't just focus on large media houses. We also go to radio stations like Munganalo. I've been to Munganalo Nene, for example. I've been to Lisedi FM, so that those people who can't necessarily digest English or understand English or science in English, we try to break it down in a simple manner for them to understand. We have reached out through the media as well to the youth So we've been invited to campaigns as well, to not just to also encourage the youth to be part of science, because like you mentioned, it might not be as interesting, but we try to make it more interesting, because science is really quite interesting in my opinion. I guess that's why I'm in the field. So we try to pitch it at different levels to different types of audience. So it's very important for scientists to understand that. And that is what we are trying to bridge as the CSIR, to say we are, as an organization, we don't want our science or our innovation to just stay at high level. We want it to infiltrate grassroots level. And this is how we're going to do it. We go physically to those communities sometimes to conduct training, to conduct community projects, to make the information accessible at grassroots level. And I hope I caught some of it.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for sharing those insights. I think they're valid. I'm actually not going to pass over to Zamo now, because I've actually got another question aligned to that, which I'll hand over to Zamo shortly. But really just perhaps to underline the presence of the support that at the CSIR is available. Not every science institution has a dedicated team who has the skills and the contacts in the media to make the communications link for you. So really to say that there is a powerful resource within the CSIR to help engage public audiences, and it's really worth using those specialists. I'm going to put a question to Lebo. It's about the trust, which is obviously an interesting conversation, especially within our current political climate. Do you think trust is reduced because of the translation, which doesn't use language or the wrong information, doesn't use their language or wrong information? So that's one aspect of the question. Are scientists able to narrate their stories about their work to the public, or they focus on peers in the same field? So I think that's talking a little bit to the question of who is the audience when it comes to talking. And what will you say if the reason why scientists don't give out information is because of policies in their institutions? I think this is something that Katikani did speak about in terms of intellectual property, etc. Is because of policies. Some institutions have policies on what to share as they are from national key points. So to Lebo, a couple of your responses to those points.
So Robert, what is the question?
So one was directly around trust. Do you think that the language issue has anything to do with the trust conversation? Understanding. So do you think trust is reduced? Perhaps it's not your direct experience, but do you think trust is reduced because of translation, which doesn't use their language or the wrong information?
I feel where trust is reduced is when they just take me as just a journalist. That I'm just working in the media, and therefore they don't trust that I'm going to take the information and to represent them well. I think that's where the trust issue comes through. So they need to come to a point where they can trust that, even though I'm not a scientist, but I've covered the subject enough to know how to represent them, so that trust can continue.
Lebo, what would you say to people who say, I've had bad experiences of publishing my work with the media. I'm not going to do it anymore because the last time I tried this, I chatted to the guy, he took up 2 hours of my day, he went away and wrote this article. Maybe it was Lebo and he didn't want to share it back with me to show me what he'd written. How would you reassure researchers in that space that they should trust you if they have had bad experiences? If you took a perspective on their work that they felt was irrelevant or wrong, what do you say?
It's the same as if you went to McDonald's and you asked for a quarter pounder and you got a Big Mac.
But that's not really true, because if you get a Big Mac, you can say, no, wait, I asked for a quarter pounder. But for a researcher who now gets published on the SABC and has words put in their mouth that they say, that wasn't me. Some researchers would feel like that'll be the end of their career. If their peers perceive them to have said those things, they might feel very well that they really are endangering a whole career.
Like I said, there's a gatekeeping. Is that Chanel?
Yeah.
Okay,
like
go ahead, Lebo.
But Lebo can go first, yeah.
Go ahead, Lebo, and then I'll give Chanel a chance.
No, that was just a joke, but like I said, there's a gatekeeping process in this. If you're not happy with my writing, you can engage it with me, and you can always escalate it to the editor.
But it's already gone out on national television, and it's the only spot we're going to get. I'm going to hand over to Chanel. It's your insights on this.
I think it's so unfortunate that sometimes that does happen, but also the first thing I want to say is that not everyone's editorial process and policy is the same. Every media house has a different editorial process. But in South Africa, there is this general perception that when one media person or house does something, you can't trust us all, which is unfortunately how it's been for a while now, or certainly since I've been in this media space. And I think if it's out there and something like that has happened, it's now your job as the scientist to make sure that you can go through the right channels to ensure that you can get a retractment statement out of the media house, or go to a different media house it sounds really awful, but a competing media house perhaps, to see if they can perhaps tell the story that you originally wanted out there, the messaging that you wanted. This is why I say healthy collaboration is extremely important. This is from the get-go. You need to sit down with the journalists, both you and scientists. That's why it's very difficult to have these sorts of conversations with PR representatives and PR people, because the scientist is the only one that can give you the direct answers you need and break it down in a way that perhaps, even if it takes forever to break it down, at some stage it's going to be both beneficial to both you and the media house, because you as a scientist, you don't want to look stupid. You as a media house, you don't want to be one of those people that aren't responsible in the messaging that you're giving. You want to be accountable and transparent in the messaging that you're giving. So it's very important that both scientists and journalists sit together, collaborate in a way that can tell the story properly. And again, I'll put this out there, make it visually appealing. So yeah.
Thanks, Liz. Maybe if we wanted to talk about trust, if we're talking about trust, maybe it's about establishing trust that the right story will get ultimately printed, and that might not be. Maybe there are other ways of making sure that the right scientific information is fed through. Can I ask Demolishing if he's got any comments to add to this? I know he's given a lot of thought to this over time.
Yes, thanks, Robert. I think, it is true that there is a trust deficit, when it comes to journalists and scientists. But the question is, how do we rebuild the trust? So I think, if we can really apply our minds and look at ways, how we can be able to do that. Because, from the one end, you want the scientist, to give you information. But at the same time, you don't want, use that information incorrectly that could have a negative impact on that scientist's career. So, I know where Lebo is coming from with this one, because as a journalist, we are used to writing our own stories, and our own stories, they will go to the editors and sub-editors, etc., throughout, the process, editorial process. But I think in this case, when it comes to science, because it's very specialized. Even if you have studied science, it's very highly unlikely that you'll be a master of all of these different fields in science. So I think for me, it will be important, for a journalist, in order to build that trust, to use, or to share some of the information that that journalists intend, to use for the story. So it means that you are not sharing your story to a scientist to play the role of an editor. What you are doing is that you are sharing your story for the scientist to check the science. And then once, the science has been checked, it's up to you now as a journalist, how do you use that information when you are writing your story? So I think, if we can apply, those kind of things, maybe in the long run, it will begin to rebuild this trust. And in the long run, maybe the scientists will never ask you, to share your information, because now they trust you that you always get things right. Because I think, the question that, Robert is asking is a very critical question, and then it can make scientists to be reluctant, to, communicate with journalists. But I think there is a middle, ground that we can meet, both parties. At the same time, we don't want to compromise, the independence of journalists. So the journalists must always stay independent. They must always be critical, even of that information. But the scientific, integrity as well is important in this process. So those are the few things that I just wanted to share, Robert. Thank you.
Thanks
Robert,
very much,
if I can add something.
Yes, please do.
So the issue of trust for me, I think maybe it's not really openly discussed, and maybe people will not openly or scientists will not openly admit it. But there's also like a hierarchy thing that happens there, where there's certain protocols. The scientists, some of the scientists are very much into reputations. That's why they want to associate themselves with reputable journal papers or journal houses. So the same thing goes to, like, for example, journalists. If you are going to engage someone who feels in his depth of heart that he is like, he's at the top of his game, and he's a journalist he's a scientist or maybe a professor who's been in the field for many years, engaging, if you send a junior journalist to engage such a person, you might not receive such a favorable response. So if you know that you're engaging maybe a junior scientist, that will be okay to send another junior journalist to engage that person. That might not be a problem. So some things, they're not openly discussed, but they are there. And that might be the reason why you don't always get a favorable response from the journalists. From the scientists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Katikani. That's a useful input as well. Great. So there's lots to discuss here, and we just want to move on so we get a bit of a diversity. I see there's a question to Zamo. SASTA owns outreach programs on behalf of DSI countrywide, and there's a huge interaction emerging from the use of vernacular in rural areas. Does the use of such indigenous language enhance the pass rate? Zam, I don't know if you're really equipped to answer that question, or just create interest and awareness of science. So perhaps you can comment on that. So that's really, does it speak into the education space and help education? And then science is communicated and taught in English, which according to my experience scares the rural kids, as I think it's for the brighter learners who can speak it fluently only. What are the ways in which all these barriers can be overcome and defeated? Thanks for that question. Over to you, Zambo.
I think, Robert, at the South African Agency for Science and Development Agency, SASTA, what we are doing, there is a unit for education. So that unit for education works very closely with schools and learners. One part of it is to really identify talent. We do that through various initiatives, such as the Science Olympiads, such as working with schools, in terms of science. So in terms of other responsibilities for SASTA now is to really create awareness in terms of science. So in terms of schools, where we are working very closely with that, at the moment I don't have data to say that there is a direct translation in terms of output, in terms of increase, pass rate, but generally, there is an understanding that when it comes to language, it does affect the pass rate. I think even the Minister of Education, has spoken about that some time back. That's why currently in the Eastern Cape, they are introducing isiXhosa now into matrics. So the learners there in the Eastern Cape will be able to write isiXhosa, they'll be able to write their matric exam in isiXhosa. Because if you look at, even if you look at other countries, for example, who are doing very well when it comes to science, you look at China, for example, they are using their own mother tongue language, and then there is some data out there that there is a correlation in terms of pass rate and the language. Because once you understand the concept in your own language and you're able to articulate those concepts, in your own language, unlike here in South Africa, where when I was at school, sometimes I was doing my English, we call it was the first grade English, because I was someone who did English, second language. I remember one of my teachers asked me in my English class, we were doing literature, why are you taking so long to respond to this question? And then I said to her, ma'am, I've studied English in second language, so for me, I think it is Xhosa, and then I have to translate that into English. So that's a kind of a thought process that we, people who are not fortunate enough to study, English. Yeah. So there is a correlation in terms of language, but in terms of sustenance of the output, I think, I'm not in a good position to say, yes, at SASA, this is what we have done, because I will need to give you data. This is what we have done with this poll. This is, the output. But I'm sure that if you're really interested in that, maybe we can communicate with me on the side. I can, point you to a right direction to people who can be able to answer that. Yeah.
Thanks, Samuel. I think really interesting questions. And maybe I've got another one for Lebo. Lebo, your thoughts on this? Now that the 4IR, and we're running low on time, so we've got about 3 minutes left, but now that the fourth industrial revolution, COVID-19 have changed the focus, the normal way of doing things, what are we implementing to engage illiterate and technologically challenged publics? So how are we getting out to those hard-to-reach audiences? And as a science communicator, do you believe in storytelling as an effective tool to engage public? And then do you narrate your stories based on... Oh, let's leave that one. Lebo, your thoughts on those?
Sorry, I beg your pardon, I couldn't catch the question. Can you please repeat it again?
Question is, what are we doing within a 4IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution, and COVID-19 context? It's changed the focus, it's changed the way we're doing things. What are we doing to engage illiterate and technologically challenged publics? How are we getting out to those audiences?
Unfortunately, with COVID, I mean, it has pushed us indoors. But then in terms of getting it to the public, I mean, there's social media, where we could publish articles and all of that, but we're still trying to find our way as to how are we going to work in this new normal. We're still trying to find our way. I mean, we've had to now, it's become a situation now where we're doing like Zoom interviews, Skype interviews, where we're not actually out there to actually find the antidotes to our story. So we're still finding our way as to how are we going to get it to those illiterate audiences. But in terms of everyone else, I mean, we're using social media and everything is going online. That's as best as I can.
And I'm going to stop it there because we are actually out of time. It's 2:59. I'd really like to thank all the panelists. I'd like to thank the CSIR for putting together this panel. I'm sure Zamatola would say, use community radio if you want to get out as far and wide as you can. So there is a really powerful channel there that's available. And really for me, I think the key idea here is about building up relationships between scientists and those media representatives, those people who have access to that channel, that powerful channel. And really, in relationship, we can start to iron out some of the challenges and start to do the job a little bit better. It's gone 3 o'clock. Really grateful for everyone's participation. Fantastic questions. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in due course. Thanks very much.